Good evening, everyone. My name is Brandon Woodard, and I have the privilege of working here at St. Benedict St. John's as the Director of Intercultural and International Student Services. And I thank you all for being here this evening. Last semester, there was a student in my office. He and I were talking about some things because last academic year he had a rough time. Then I checked in with him and said, hey, why don't you stop by my office so we can talk and catch up. I can see how you're doing since you had a rough last year academically. So he was in my office last semester in the fall. I was asking him all kinds of questions and everything, and he was talking about how he feels like he's missing something, but things are going well. He's in a leadership position on campus, etc. And somehow we got on the topic of, is there any man that you look up to on campus? And he said, no. I'm like, oh, thanks. All good. Continued the conversation, and a few minutes later he came back and he said, actually, you know what? There is one. Liam. Liam's the kind of guy that I want to be. And he said, I only had Liam for one class, if I remember correctly. He said, in that one class, he was absolutely amazing. He said, it would be so cool if we could get Liam back. All right. And so I emailed Liam and said, hey, you interested in making a trip out to Minnesota? He's like, yeah, sure. Liam was here for 1 year. In the 1 year that he was here, there are at least 2 people in this room who changed their majors or minors because of Liam's. 1 year he was here. And that's just 2 folks that I'm really aware of who being here, maybe more people. In the 36 hours that he's been here, he's even made changes. Yesterday he gave a presentation to some faculty and staff for professional development. There are about 45 faculty and staff members there yesterday. And we did some exercises, we did some group work, he laid some knowledge on us. And this morning at about 8 or so o'clock, I got an email from a colleague saying someone was at his presentation yesterday, and because of that, they're going to be doing something. And then I saw the forwarded email, and it said, there's a bathroom in my space, and it's a single stall bathroom. I want that to be accessible for people with disabilities, but I also want that to be an all-gender bathroom. Here's some ideas that I have for the design for the planner or the pictures that go on the door. Can the Mellon grant help fund this? And my colleagues and I emailed back and forth, yeah, this would be a great idea for the Mellon grant. This evening before we had dinner, I checked my email again. We had said, yes, you should probably consider this, 8 hours ago, 9 hours ago? At about 5 o'clock this evening, I saw an email that said, this is happening. 36 hours. Liam's presence and his time that he spent here at St. Benedict St. John's has been revolutionary, and I can actually use that word because we have more all-inclusive or all-gender inclusive restrooms. We have more students who, while he was here, came out as queer, trans, questioning, non-binary, gender non-conforming. We had more students who had that opportunity to experience this amazing person. And so without further ado, I'm going to get out of the way and let you all experience this amazing person. Please welcome Dr. Liam Lair.
Hey y'all, how's it going? I was just thinking, if I'm ever having a bad month, I'll just call Brandon and tell him to bring me out here so he can just tell me all the amazing things that I've done. So thank you all so much for having me here. A few things before I start. one of the things that I think is amazing about this community is that it makes people like me look really good because of all the work that you all are doing, because of the work that Brandon's doing. And I mean, I want to do work that is transformative, and I want to challenge people to think differently and to think about gender at the intersection of race, at the intersection of all the different ways we exist in the world. And so, yeah, I gave a talk yesterday that seemed to be really good and effective, but then the fact is that somebody took that, left that space, and actually did something, right? And that's how we make change, is that I can get up here and say some fancy stuff, but if it's not useful to you, that stops there. But if it is useful to you, then what do you do with it, right? So just to give credit also back to this community, because y'all are awesome. But again, thank you so much for having me here today to talk about the politics of gender in 2019, because that's an easy 45-minute talk, right? And I lost my little remote. Here we go. Sorry, let me see if I can get these little buttons down. There we go. So yeah, it's been a whirlwind of 2 days. So if you've been in any of the classes I've talked in, once I wrote this, then of course I'm like plagiarizing my own talk. So I've already used some of the examples. So if they're familiar to you, hopefully it will remind you of how useful they might be in you having these conversations moving forward. So anyway, without further ado, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end, let's talk about the politics of gender in 2019. Here we go. So what I want to do, I want to think about gender oppression and where are we right now in 2019. And I want to give you some really specific examples. Sorry, I'm going to move my water because it's sort of at an angle, and it's going to fall. Happened in class last week. It was with coffee, though, and I didn't have any coffee for the rest of the class. And it was a bad scene. Okay, so I want to talk about gender oppression and where are we now. And I think a lot of times when we talk about gender oppression or sexism or cissexism, we talk about individual instances. Like, I experienced this, I got catcalled, or I experienced something in particular. And I think that that's really important, but I think what we miss a lot of times, particularly in mainstream media, is talking about the structures that shape our understanding of gender, sexism, gender bias, and gender discrimination. So I want to think particularly about 4 different ways that gender oppression manifests structurally, right? So in culture, history, ideology, and institutions. And I think citation is also really important. So I want to pause here for a second and cite 2 authors, Robin DiAngelo and Özlem Sensoy, right? They wrote a book called Is Everyone Really Equal? And this is taken a little bit from them, because this is how they conceptualize and explain oppression, right? And how that's different than discrimination. That as a white person, I can experience racial discrimination because that's sort of a one-off individual example or situation that might happen. People can not like me because I'm white, right? But can I experience racism and racial oppression? Absolutely not. Because when you think about social power and the ways racism manifests in our culture, in history, in ideology, and institutions, it privileges white people. And that's not going to change tomorrow. It's not going to change 10 years from now. So thinking about the difference between oppression and discrimination is really important, and it's important to have that language. So I want to make that citation here. So I want to think about gender oppression in these structural ways, but then we'll come back to the end and think about how we respond, because these structures shape our individual biases, the ways that we're either challenged in our individual views of gender oppression or experience, but also it can also challenge those things, right? So we'll talk about how we respond. So first, cultural sexism. So I'm curious in this space, and it seems like, I think, you never know when you walk into these spaces, right? And I'm reading the room, I get the sense that most folks are already on board with some of this stuff. So we can speed through some of this stuff. But how many of you, when you came to St. John's, were warned about walking alone at night, and why? So raise a hand, how many of you were warned about walking alone at night? So everyone kind of look around, right? And I'm not asking you to assume people's gender, but I think it's interesting the demographic of folks who are raising their hands are folks that already is more feminine across the board. Not everyone, right? So why, for those of some of you who were warned about walking alone at night, why? You're gonna get lost? Like, yeah, quit. Stranger danger, say more. What do you mean stranger danger? You're a stranger, yeah, don't give me candy.
Exactly, like, just like sketchy situations, just people you're not familiar with.
Okay.
To be wary of that.
Okay, yeah.
I was told, like, especially on weekends, because, like, when people get drunk, you never know what they're gonna do, or like.
All people? men. So I think the specificity is important, right? When we talk about these examples of stranger danger, you're not taught to be scared of other women, you're taught to be scared of men, right? Yeah.
I think in a lot of ways we're also taught not to put ourselves in those situations. We are taught not to walk alone at night. Not the other way. It's not like we're teaching people, hey, don't do something to someone.
No, but I think that's an important piece, right, around victim blaming, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well, is like whose responsibility is it to protect women, to protect people from violence, right? But it's interesting, if we think about the gender dynamics of that, right, it's 2019, and this is still a thing, which is exhausting, right? But if we think about sexual violence and rape culture and the way it's normalized, where a lot of times when I ask my students who was warned about walking home alone at night, folks that identify as feminine or as women raise their hands, and they didn't see anything weird about it. They aren't outraged by the fact that they were told, be careful when you walk alone at night. And a lot of the folks who identify as men in those spaces, it never occurred to them. Like, oh, this is weird. I never thought about, because I didn't know it was happening. Right? So the way that this is normalized, where folks who identify as women follow, for those of you who've taken gender studies, right, it's called a rape schedule, where you schedule your life around not being vulnerable, right? And this is so every day. And one of the statistics that I found as I was preparing for this talk that is just sort of, kind of takes my breath away, is that almost 3,000 people died when the World Trade Centers were attacked, which was tragic and devastating, right? And I think many of you in this space weren't alive when that happened, or you were very young. I was in college. I was a junior in college, and I remember watching the second tower fall, right? And I think those of us who were alive could all say exactly where we were and what that moment felt like, right? And it was devastating. And I think the response is complicated, and I don't support many of the things we've done in response, but I get that there's a response to violence, right? But last year, over 2,000 women were murdered by a current or former partner, and what do we do about that, right? So this is December 2018. Congress allowed the Violence Against Women Act to expire. Now, it's still being funded, and it's been extended, but it still has yet to be reauthorized. So we don't attend to violence against women in the same way we attend to other kinds of violence, because it's so normalized. Even the way we talk about it, right? Who's missing in the phrase violence against women? The perpetrator, right? And this is actually, I was a late bloomer educationally, y'all. I did not know what passive voice was until I think I was in grad school, which is not cute. If you don't know what it is, that's okay, because I obviously didn't. But the way I learned it was talking about violence against women. In a lot of reporting, we read headlines like, she was raped. There's no perpetrator. He was attacked. By who? Right? We take the perpetrator out of that formulation, and we aren't attending or talking about the folks that need to be held accountable, right? To your point, Josie, right? We talk about people how not to get raped. We don't tell people don't rape, right? And Slutwalk has that really cool poster, if y'all haven't seen it, and it has like 12 steps. Don't put something in someone's drink. Use a buddy. Make sure they don't rape someone, right? And it's sort of a play on words, but when you start to read it, you realize how absurd it is that we put the onus on women, for the most part, to not experience sexual violence. But then that also, the ways we talk about this, 95 to 98% of perpetrators of sexual violence are men or masculine people. But we also don't talk about people who are survivors who identify as men or masculine, right? Because when I started teaching this stuff, I taught, 95% of survivors identify as women. And that's not the case. It's more like 60-40, right? But we also silence that and don't talk about that. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way homophobia sort of navigates or sort of exists in our culture. Anxieties about men feeling feminized, and we don't believe men either, right? Which I think is something we need to explore more. So this is a thing. And I'll give this Prezi to Brandon, and y'all can access it. There's a link that talks about the Violence Against Women Act, if you're interested in learning more. We also have stuff like this. So again, we're talking about cultural sexism. I moved on her like a bitch, but I couldn't get there, and she was married. You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet, just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything. Grab them by the pussy, you can do anything. Who said this? Trump said this, right? And I was in a breakfast this morning with Donna Freitas, and she said something really, I think, interesting, that this isn't a Republican-Democrat thing, right? There were lots of Republican candidates that we could have elected, but there's something that we do when we see something like this. We literally have a recording of it, and we're still like, that's cool, that's okay. That doesn't disqualify from someone from the highest office in the land, right? And he's just the most sort of egregious example at this point in terms of what he can say and what he gets away with. But we've also had Democratic presidents who are perpetrators, right? We have several people on the Supreme Court. There are 14 accusations against Trump right now of sexual assault and sexual violence. And what message is this communicating to folks? That we don't believe you, but that's okay because it's just our culture. Boys will be boys. It's locker room talk, right? So the ways that this exists at this cultural level, that, I mean, it occurs with individuals, but it has this permissiveness that I think we don't even recognize sometimes because it's just so, we're so saturated with it. Who can tell me about this picture? What is this? R. Kelly. And who is he talking to? Or screaming over? Gayle King. And I so admire her poise in this moment to not react to him, right? And if you've seen interviews with her after this interview, what she has to say about it I think is really interesting in terms of how she's navigating his anger and his aggression, right? And this is a complicated scene, right? Because I think that there are also ways that folks in the media will take something like this up and demonize him in a way that they won't a white man who is doing the same thing. Right? All of the sort of the cultural tropes around black men and anger and aggression and violence, which is one of the reasons I was so grateful in some ways that she sat there, right? She wasn't scared of him. She wasn't scared of violence from him. But he does this interesting thing, right? He does this, Kavanaugh did this, we've seen it. Harvey Weinstein, Brock Turner did this. It's this new term that I don't know if y'all have heard of it, and maybe y'all have heard of it way before, but this has just come about in the past month or so that I learned. It's this term DARVO. Have you all heard of this? So this really gives insight into what happened in that moment with R. Kelly, what happens in these moments when we see folks who are perpetrators get accused and they play the victim, right? So DARVO is deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. And it's this language we have that really characterizes the reaction of perpetrators, particularly sexual offenders, when they the way that they respond in being held accountable for their behavior, right? So they deny the behavior, first of all, I didn't do it. They attack the individual doing the confronting, how dare you, right? And then they reverse the roles of victim and offender, where the perpetrator all of a sudden is the victim, and the offender, right, quote unquote, the true victim becomes the person who's doing the offense. And another person who I would really encourage y'all to read that I think does a really good job of talking about this, not in this way, is Sarah Ahmed. She wrote this book called Living a Feminist Life. And if you want to read the really sort of short version of that, she wrote an article called Feminist Killjoy and Other Willful Subjects. And one of the wonderful things she does is she gives us permission to be feminist killjoys, first of all. But she talks about when you name the problem, you become the problem. Right? And I feel like we've all had those family dinners where you call something out and you're like, God, that was really messed up. And they're like, why are you ruining dinner? Right? All of a sudden, you become the problem. Right? And I think this is sort of that on a cultural level, where this happens time and time again. And then always catcalling. Right? Which I'm really confused by this. Has this ever worked? Where someone walks by and you're like, hey, and you're like, oh, yeah. Totally. Like I'm very confused by that. I mean, does anyone, actually I'm really curious, does anybody have any examples when that's worked? But people still, I'm confused by it. Anyway, but another example of how this cultural permissiveness around, we teach young boys and men that they have access to women's bodies in lots of different ways, right? Not just touching them, but yelling things out at them, right? I had a student who asked me, you know, how do I treat men and women the same, or how do I say hi to someone without gendering them? I was like, well, and he's like, well, you know, if like I say, hey man, whatever. And it was a great question. I was like, well, how would you say hi to a woman? He's like, well, I would just say hi. I was like, great answer. Right? Or if we think about the way we touch people, right? If you are a masculine person and you would put your hand on the small of a woman's back to walk her into the room, if you wouldn't do that for a guy, which you probably wouldn't, right? Unless you're dating, which is cute. Why are you touching other people in that way, right? And this is stuff we have to train ourselves out of, right? I forget that sometimes, right? I don't always check in with my partner like, do you want me to put my hand on your lower back, or does that sort of creep you out, right? So to also give ourselves permission to make mistakes, but to recognize the things that we're doing, the mannerisms we're always engaging in, reflect this larger culture, right? Oh yeah, I have that little, 95% of folks have experienced catcalling or street harassment in some capacity. So that's a number for y'all. Okay, historical sexism. How many of y'all have used the restroom today? I promise this connects. People are like, yes. I kept telling the classes that I spoke in earlier, I was like, if you have not used the restroom today, you need to hydrate. Because it was like noon, and I was like, if y'all have not used the restroom, please drink more water. I don't think I drank any water when I was an undergrad. I also didn't do very well, so don't follow my lead. So if we think about the histories of sexism, the histories of gender bias, and the ways that they intersect and overlap with other forms of oppression, right? And I think the bathrooms are a really good example of that. Where women who are trans, cis, and non-binary are literally disallowed in public space, right? Allowed to not even exist. Because if you have left your house and you are out in public and you need to use the restroom, you need that to be in public space. And if I can't access those same facilities, what is that saying to me about who's allowed in public, right? And so we can trace this history, right? So for trans people, the reality is terrifying, right? Where 0 instances of men dressing up as women to assault women in the bathroom has ever happened. Like, it's not a thing. The people experiencing violence and oppression and harassment in bathrooms are trans people. But even more than that, masculine women, right? I don't experience, I mean, no one would know I'm trans, for those of you that don't know. I'll get into that in a little bit. I'm trans, I was assigned female at birth, but I now look and act like a dude sometimes, a little bit. But on a day-to-day basis, I use the men's restroom, and I don't experience harassment because I look like a guy. No one questions that, right? But my friends who are women, who are very masculine, without a doubt, every single time they use a public restroom, right? If there's someone else in there, they're going to get something said to them. They're going to get the cops called on them. And I always ask students, and I know this is true for y'all, if you've walked into a restroom you didn't mean to be in, what did you do? You walked out, right? It's not, we all do that, ooh, right? If somebody walks in and stays, that's where they're supposed to be, right? So this is a reality for trans people, right? But this is what gets sort of trotted out. Who's going to be waiting for your wife and daughter, right? And I have been at city hall meetings. I have been at meetings at institutions like St. Ben, St. John's, not here, but other places. And this is what we hear time and again, right? If we allow this, right, as if like the little placard keeps people out who want to do things in bathrooms. I'm very confused by that also. I'm basically confused by a lot of things in life. But this is what gets trotted out, right? And what I think is interesting about this is not only about these arguments that get trotted out time and again, but there's this assumption when we talk about gender, when we talk about wives and daughters, we're not talking about all wives and daughters, because this is reliant upon a history of racism, right? And there's this sort of figure of the white innocent woman and the white innocent child. And this very much relies on that, right? That those are the innocent victims of the scary trans people. Those are the innocent victims of men dressing up as women and attacking people in bathrooms, right? And it's not a far cry from the way, again, that women are defined by bathrooms. In Jim Crow South, right, in the segregated South, these were bathrooms, right? We have ladies, we have men, and we have colored. And I just want to be clear, right, for those of you that maybe haven't had classes where you talk about language, this is outdated language, right? This is language we wouldn't generally use anymore. I would encourage you to use people of color. But this is what bathrooms were in the segregated South, right? Who can be a lady in this picture? White people, right? Who can be men? White people. So it's interesting to trace the histories of bathrooms and not only who it disallows in public space, but how this defines who gets to be men and who gets to be women, right? And this isn't a trans thing, right? This is a race thing, right? But then when we trace these histories, we see how they overlap and how bathrooms continue to define who can be in public, right? Thinking about disability. If you have a personal assistant of a different gender than you, how are you allowed in that space? If you have a disability and you can't access that space at all, if you are a parent and you have a kid, how do you access that space? So bathrooms are very revealing of these histories, right? Another interesting thing, who can tell me or take a guess what this picture is of? Any guesses? Congress, right? This is actually the 114th Congress. I have some statistics that support the aesthetics of that picture of the 116th Senate. And you can see this breakdown, right? So we have 100 folks in the Senate. Let me see, this has a little 91 white folks. We got, do they not have men as a category? No. We got 24 women, which is better than before, right? So thinking about histories, right, of how we get here, because our women, our queer folks, our people of color less qualified to be in these positions, no, but we have to think about the histories that funnel particular people into particular positions, into particular access to education. But then even when you get there, the histories of those buildings reflect who should be there. So for example, when year did women senators get a restroom where they didn't have to use the tourist restroom anymore? 1993. What year did women in the House get a restroom? 2011, right? Before that, they had to use the tourist restroom, which if they had to do that during a vote, they might miss the vote because it was a long enough walk where they then had to come back and vote. So they just had to not be hydrated. Hydration is basically the key tonight, right? So again, the ways that these histories shape all of our lives in really intense ways when it comes to gender and gender bias. Okay, 7:31, we're good. Ideological sexism. Who can define ideology for me real quick? Say it louder. Maureen, go.
System of beliefs.
Easy. System of beliefs, systems of ideas, framework for understanding the world, right? So has anyone heard the term man up before, or you throw like a girl, or things like that? So tell me, when have you heard these things? Have you said these things? I probably have, right? When have you heard these things? What's happening? Yeah.
They're like sporting events, or like if you're playing a game, like a sport.
And so who says it to who? You're playing sports, who says it to who?
Either a parent saying it to their child, or a coach saying it to the
Okay.
member of the team.
And what are they trying to communicate when they say you throw like a girl? They're saying like you are the best right now? Or are they saying you're really bad?
You're bad.
You're really bad. All right, other examples, other folks. Either these phrases or other phrases.
You cry.
And what gets said?
Man up.
And what are they telling you when they tell you to man up?
Stop crying.
Okay. Right, because it's weak.
Yeah.
It's bad. You're being feminine. Right? And I'm sure a lot of you have these examples, right? Sorry, I keep moving, so you have to like keep turning around. But this reflects a system of ideas that we have about gender, about who should be doing what things, who should be feeling what emotions, who should be acting in what particular ways. So there's this really cool show on Netflix called The Toys That Made Us. Have you all seen this or heard of this? It's fascinating. It tells the history of all the toys we played with when we were kids, like Star Wars toys, G.I. Joe, Barbie. And it's really interesting because one of the examples I use with my students is, right, how many of you played with G.I. Joes? All right, a number of you, right? How many of you played with Barbies? A number of you, right? What's so fascinating is that we call Barbies dolls. We call G.I. Joe action figures. It's a doll, right? And in this show, they talk about their sort of frustration or anxiety about what size to make G.I. Joe and Star Wars figures and what to call them. Because they were anxious about calling them dolls, because they wanted to make sure they had a good market to sell these toys to. And they knew that if they coded it as feminine, boys wouldn't buy it. Right? Where feminine folks are much more likely to buy masculine identified things, toys, washes, whatever. I used a men's razor for years. They're way better than the women's razors, right? Yeah. Yes. And half the price, right? We also charge women more for things generally. But this reflects a system of ideas, right? And these unconscious biases that we have from being socialized, and we aren't just socialized from our families, it's media, it's TV shows, it's all of these things, right? And this manifests also in the way we assume heterosexuality, we assume people being cis, that we read gender in particular ways. So John versus Jennifer, right? So there's this resume study that Stanford or Yale? Yale? It's all those Ivy League fancy schools, right? Where they did this study, right? And they passed these resumes out, and some of you might have heard this, where they passed resumes out to a whole bunch of folks, women, men, people of all genders, identical resumes, one said John, one said Jennifer. And what was fascinating about that, and again, those of you that have heard this study more, or heard this study before, is that John, on average, was offered the job more frequently. He was offered, on average, $4,000 more, and he had more offers of mentorship, right? And it reflects the system of ideas of what we value and what we don't. We value masculinity. We value men in a different way, right? I've seen that in my own transition, right? I lived my life for 29 years as a woman, and when people took me sort of seriously, but as soon as I started medically transitioning, my voice dropped, I kind of got a beard, I have more authority, people take me more seriously, my student evaluations went up. Was I doing anything different? No, right? But we value masculine qualities. We value masculinity, and we devalue femininity on anybody, right? On women, on men, on people of any gender. We devalue femininity in lots of ways. So it's right we say man up, because we see emotion as weakness. We see tears as weakness, especially when it's on bodies we perceive to be men. And this is complicated by race in really intense ways, right? They've done studies too where it's Joe and Jose. And as soon as Jose drops that S, he gets all the calls. Daniel and Dante, right? Names that we can identify with a particular racial group have incredible and significant impacts on who gets called back for jobs and who gets interviews, right? John Oliver does this really great thing on the wage gap on his show Last Week Tonight. And he's really funny because he's like, over the lifetime, you get $4,000 more from this thing, that adds up. And he's like, maybe all women should just change their name to John, right? It might be a little bit confusing at first, but you'll have $4,000 to take the edge off, right? And I'm like, okay, all right, cool. But right, we shouldn't have to change our names, right? But we need to recognize how this is happening at a cultural level. Because part of this, and what I hope you all are doing at your studies here at St. Ben's, is not just identifying these individual instances of when this happens, but recognizing the patterns. Because if we can name the patterns, and if we can connect our individual experiences to those patterns, all of a sudden we have an ideology, we have a framework for explaining what's happening. And that's what I love about gender studies and feminist theories, that it gives us a way to explain why this is the case, right? It gives you ammo, for lack of a better word, maybe that's not the best word, evidence, right? Not ammo, that's scary. Yeah. Anyway, it gives you evidence, right, to have these conversations when people are like, sexism's not real, racism's not real. Well, how do you explain this, right? Because if you don't have a framework to explain that, here's one. Let's talk about this, right? And there's another link there that you can look to for studying. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting about our ideology is this both sides of the story thing. We're like, let's value both sides of the story, right? Everyone has an equal opportunity to give us their perspective, right? And in some cases, that's absolutely true. But in other ways, I'm going to say that's actually not accurate, right? And why? Because it ignores imbalances in power. Because really what I'm talking about tonight are imbalances of power, right? When culture, history, ideology, and institutions reflect and privilege one group over another, we're talking about social power. And saying that both sides of the story are equally valid and carry equal weight, we're ignoring imbalances of power, right? So we have to think about who has power and privilege in this situation that we're talking about, whether it's sexual assault, whether it's hiring, no matter what it is, who has privilege and power? Whose identities are valued or devalued, right? We value masculine identities, we value straight identities, we value cis identities, we do not value folks of color. That's why we have to say black and brown lives matter. We don't value trans lives. That's why we have to say trans lives matter, right? If we valued those lives, we wouldn't have to say it. And how do we attend to historical and cultural patterns? Again, right, not anecdotal evidence, but patterns. So how do we think about this in terms of gender oppression, right? Men have historically had power and continue to benefit from privilege. We value men's voices and opinions more than women's or folks of other genders. And how do we account for historic power imbalances and the ways in which culture has taught us to interact? Women saying, I'm sorry, all the time, right? Men interrupting women, or mansplaining, also white-splaining, all the splainings, right? If you don't know what that is, Google it. There's great videos. Dismissing women as over-emotional, right? And the way we even label women acting on sort of in masculine ways, that they get labeled as very differently than men would doing those same things, right? Women bosses, we all know what they get called when they are empowered and make calls and tell people what to do and are really good at the job. They don't get a good name, right? So this both sides of the story thing, just to really think about when that comes up in your classes or in your conversations, you can say, like, I want to hear and I want to dialogue about what you're saying, but I also want you to recognize that this conversation is not happening in a vacuum, right? All right, institutional sexism. What do you think I mean when I say institutions? Like, what is an institution that you can think of? Hint word at one. Yes. CSBSJU. What might be another example of an institution? We're affiliated with one. Yes. The church. Brilliant. Y'all are on it. Right. Government, school, church, science, right? All of these things, right? And again, it's not just sexism and gender oppression. This is racism, ableism, all of these things, but they are embedded in our institutions, right? And we have to hold these institutions accountable. And some institutions are much more willing to be held accountable than others, right? And I think bathrooms are a really great example of this in terms of literally the spaces in which we live. You can tell so much about an institution when you look at their bathrooms, right? Who is at the table when this space was designed? Who is welcome here, right? Who are they inviting in? Because if I go into a place and I can't use a bathroom, well, cool, thanks, y'all, for inviting me in, right? So institutions have to be held accountable, right? And the Catholic Church is having a reckoning right now with some of that, right? And there are spaces where that is more honest because it has to be, right? Because there are people that are invested in the institution of the Catholic Church and they need that and it fulfills their lives in really incredible ways, right? So how do we have that conversation and how do we engage in restorative justice and reconciliation in ways that acknowledges the hurt, but also gives space to heal and be better, and then decide, do I want to stay or do I want to go, and where are those spaces, right? And there's folks doing really amazing work to support folks, right? SNAP, Survivors Networks of Abused Priests, the Spotlight journalists with the Boston Globe, a lot of you probably saw that movie, right? They're holding these institutions accountable. Ongoing investigations and documentation, right? There's been new investigations in Pennsylvania, I think Illinois, that's uncovering this stuff. And I'm always really interested, and I think it says so much about an institution by how people react when this stuff gets uncovered, right? Are they like, God, we really messed up. How do we be in communication with the folks that we hurt to make this better? Or, no, we didn't do it, right? It reveals a lot about an institution, about the individuals in those institutions. Title IX, right? And yeah, I think you all hear a lot about this. But I put this up here because I think what's so wonderful about the way the Title IX stuff has sort of occurred and institutions are being held accountable was because two women, Annie Clark and Andrea Pino from UNC Chapel Hill, held these institutions accountable. How many of you have seen The Hunting Ground? A number of you. If you haven't seen it, it's actually not on Netflix right now, which is sort of a bummer, but I'm pretty sure St. Ben St. John's owns it. But it's a documentary about sexual assault on college campuses. And two women were fed up with their institution and they're like, we're gonna do something about it. So they learned how to file this complaint and send it to the federal government. And the federal government was like, y'all are spot on. We're gonna investigate all these institutions, right? And there's this reckoning that's happening right now with how do we navigate this and handle sexual assault on college campuses. Another institution, the government and science, right? So this new move to define sex as either male or female, unchangeable, and determined by the genitals that a person is born with, right? Which I find really interesting in terms of not only the government, but the way we're reckoning with science as an institution, right? That scientists don't actually agree on how to define sex, right? So I'm gonna show you this chart. This is the simplest chart I could find to explain biological sex, right? So this is on here. Y'all can download this when you get it, right? So just to take this top left, right? We got chromosomes, genes, hormones, internal and external sex organs. And that's just till birth. and there's a whole bunch of stuff after, right? And that if you have an absence of this SRY gene, which I don't know what that is, and you have typical biological female hormones and whatevers, and internal and external genital structures, then okay, maybe you can be female, right? But then there's all of these other things that happen, right? And there's all these intersex conditions, right? So like Turner syndrome, I don't know what 45, I failed chemistry, I sort of took biology. There's Turner syndrome, something to do with 45X chromosome, right? There's a gene mutation with CYP whatever, right? You can have androgen intensity syndrome. You can have Klinefelter syndrome. Like there's all these different ways that we're embodied in the world that we don't talk about that this definition totally ignores, right? It's like, it's just genitals. Cool. Right? All right. Cool, dude. And it just ignores all the ways that we exist in the world with different kinds of bodies, right? So how do we hold these institutions accountable? And so right before we get to how we respond, okay, I'm okay on time, I think. Okay, cool. Bye, y'all. Thanks for coming. Have a good night, y'all. So how do these structures affect us, and how do we change the structures? And part of the reason I'm asking this question is a really amazing book called American Islamophobia. And the author is this guy, Khaled Beydoun, and he talks about the way that these structures shape us and the ways that we shape the structures, right? So if you haven't read the book, it's really incredible. I teach the introduction in my Intro to Women's and Gender Studies class because Islamophobia, I think, is hopefully we all know, is a really big issue right now. And people are experiencing extreme rates of violence just being perceived to be Muslim, right? So how do these structures affect us, and how do we change the structures, right? And it's this process that's in flux because it's a relationship. I think it's really easy to distance ourselves, let me move my mouse, sorry y'all, from these structures and say, well, that's the government, that's policy, it doesn't have anything to do with me, or that's the sort of the national rhetoric around gender oppression or sexual assault. But we forget that we're exposed to this, we're inundated with this all the time, and it can either challenge or justify the unconscious bias we already have, right? So how are we as individuals emboldened by these structures? How are our biases justified, or how are they challenged, right? And there's opportunities where they can be challenged, but I think in our current political climate, a lot of bias, particularly around gender, race, and lots of other things, right? We're not being challenged to think better or do better. We're being emboldened to act on these unconscious biases. This is why we've seen an uptick in violent acts at the level of the individual, right? But when that gets taken up in the national media, we just talk about, oh, this guy, he had mental health issues, he was a lone wolf, he was doing all these things, and we don't connect those individual acts to the structures that have justified and emboldened those particular behaviors, right? That justified his behaviors, right? Because the perpetrators of the most violence in the US are young white men, right? So thinking about how we can't reduce racism, sexism, and other acts of violence and oppression to single actors, right? We've been talking about structures and how they're cultural, historical, ideological, institutional, and we're doing a disservice by focusing on individuals, right? We have to recognize these systems and the structures I've been talking about, but also our complicity in them, right? That we've all been socialized in some capacity wherever we grew up, right? And if you grew up and were raised in the US, you were taught to value straightness, whiteness, cisness, able-bodiedness, all of these things, right? I was taught that. As a trans person, I am still unlearning and will be unlearning transphobia for the rest of my life, right? That we are all complicit in these structures by existing in this culture. So how do we hold ourselves accountable but recognize that the structures can be challenged by us, right? Because again, the structures can justify, embolden, and affirm unconscious bias. And that's the hardest part about this, y'all, is that it's unconscious most of the time. We don't even recognize it's happening, right? The things we do on a day-to-day basis. So to take a smaller example, right? How many folks in this space shave their legs? All right, why? I mean, honestly, don't get me wrong. I spent many years shaving my legs, and it is wonderful to get into a clean bed with clean sheets. It feels so good, right? Nicely shaven legs. Why do you shave your legs? Why did you start shaving your legs?
Because in 4th grade, somebody told me I looked like a boy for having hairy legs.
So you got shamed into it?
Yeah.
Okay. Other folks? Why do you shave your legs?
For pride.
For pride. Cute. I mean, there are times where it's necessary. I mean, don't get me wrong. Right? But it's interesting, yeah. Yeah. Right. So it's interesting if we think about the things that we do and the ways that we discipline our bodies. And if we really think about why, because, right? And don't get me wrong. If folks in this space who identify as feminine, who are women, particularly if you identify as straight or if you want to date folks who identify as men, are there consequences if you stop shaving your legs? There might be. You get told you're disgusting. You get told it's not pretty, right? As if like a different set of genitals would all of a sudden make your leg hair not disgusting. Like also, again, something I'm really confused by, right? Like why is leg hair on one body disgusting but not on another, right? If we start to think about and uncover all these things we do without even thinking about it, because it's just what we're supposed to do, right? How transformative that might be, right? And how it also might save particularly feminine identified folks a lot of money. How much money do you think an average woman spends on makeup in her lifetime? It's like $15,000, y'all. What? Right? I mean, I stay with my friends. They have like 30 things in their bathroom that I am very confused by that I never really understood, which is why I was not a very successful woman when I was a woman. It was a thing, right? I don't know. But all of this is to say, right, that if we think about all of the ways that these systems of oppression, that these structures operate, that they are not distinct, and that as individuals we're shaped by them, but we can also shape them, right? We're not powerless in this, right? Can we change the culture tomorrow? No. But can we make incremental change in our individual lives, with each other, and in this community? Absolutely, right? And I think the key is to remember that all of this is connected. That when we silo out these conversations and just talk about gender without also talking about race, we're doing ourselves a disservice, right? Because if we're just talking about gender without talking about race, we actually are talking about race, we're just talking about white folks, right? If we're just talking about race and we're not also talking about sexual identity or queer folks or trans folks, right? We actually are talking about it, but we're just talking about straight, cis, black folks, right? That if we aren't recognizing how, and again, this is why I love the example of the bathroom and the history of the bathroom, because it reflects a really interesting and devastating history around who gets to be in public, who gets access to these particular gendered categories, and who counts, right? So remember that this is all connected. So a little bit, I'm going to throw this to y'all in a little bit. How do we respond? And I think the key to this, again, is to remember that we're all implicated. For those of you that were here the year I was here 3 years ago, do y'all remember when Dr. Tatum was here? God, it was so amazing, right? President Hinton sat down and interviewed her, and it was incredible. And I still teach part of her book in my intro class. And one of my favorite examples from her class is the moving walkway. Does anybody remember the moving walkway? If you don't, that's totally cool. Okay, cool. So the moving walkway, she talks about the moving walkway, like imagine that moving walkway is sexism, right? Every single one of us is on the moving walkway. So I stand on the walkway. I don't have to do anything, and I'm moving forward. I'm a part of the system, right? So I could be a total jerk and walk faster and actively participate and perpetuate sexism, right? Women are the worst, right? I'm like walking really fast. Which I'm not going to do that, right? But I'm on this walkway, so I could choose to move forward. But the trick is, because we're on the walkway, you can't just be a passive bystander. You can't just stay there. You have to turn around. And not only do you have to walk faster than the walking movement is going, right? To begin to undo some of this work. And the other thing that can be frustrating about this is we never get off the walkway, right? But it's way more empowering when you're not walking alone the other way, right? So part of this is also finding the community of folks that are going to help you walk faster and help you do better to walk faster when you trip, right? They're going to catch you. So we're all implicated, and I think that's really important to keep in mind. So I want us to think about, at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University, how do we respond to these structures and these systems that are operating outside of this institution but are operating at this institution, right? And part of it, I think, is reflecting on your own experiences of gender oppression. And I say this for every single person in this room, right? I don't think that men can experience gendered oppression, but I think that sexism limits every single one of us in this space, right? Whether it's things that you were shamed for, man up, right? Or you throw like a girl, stop crying, right? You can't wear pink, you can't play with those toys, right? That the material realities of these things in our lives are different depending on our gender, but we're all affected by it, right? So recognizing and thinking about your own experiences, right? The pay gap. How many of y'all went to high schools where y'all had uniforms, right? And everyone I talked to where there was uniforms, especially if it was a gender mixed school, all of the onus of making sure your knees are covered, making sure your shoulders are covered, making sure you're not showing too much skin was on women, right? Which I think is profoundly anti-male. To tell men that you are so unable to control your own impulses that we have to tell women to do all this stuff, right? Treating men as if they didn't have the capacity to be civil and dignified and respect other people. Like, how profoundly anti-male is that argument, right? And thinking of the ways that we victim blame, the ways folks experience exclusion all the time. So I want to ask you all, how many of you have taken a gender studies class? Party. What are some of the things you've learned from gender studies classes and how we might respond to these structures and whatever's happening up there? I'm going to put you all on the spot. Use your knowledge. And you got some teachers in here, so make them feel good. What's stuff that y'all have learned that you can do? How do we respond?
Be passive. You have to, when you experience like microaggressions or you see someone partaking in like small things, you can't be a bystander. You have to like be able to stand up and be like, hey, like that's not okay, and this is why. Or like, hey, like I'm your friend and I love you, but this is what you're saying could affect someone in this or this way.
Right. Can anybody give me a specific example of when you've seen that happen, whether or not you intervened? Because intervening is super hard, right? What are some examples, if anyone can think of one, where you've seen this happen, where you've seen someone say something sexist, something dismissive of feminine people or women? Yeah.
Well, I think just an example, it's not really saying something, but there's the sexual assault canvas thing in Sexton right now, and I was a little bit bothered by like some of the phrasing, like the rhetoric surrounding some of the things, because it was always like support her, believe her, and I just realized that that assumes that women are the only victims of sexual assault.
Yeah, yeah.
I think to add on to that, on top of it, there was a phrase written, "Happy April Fool's Day, dumb, ... Like basically saying like your experience is dumb and the people that support you are dumb and this whole thing is a joke. And I think like things like that you need to really like be like, no, it's not dumb. Like this is real. Like people experience pain because of this, and like by exposing it and talking about it, like people are educated and they understand like that's not an okay thing to say.
Yeah, I mean that's damaging. Yeah.
Also learning like the appropriate, I say that with like relatively response to those things, like responding with anger won't change things, but responding with like a conversation, question.
Okay.
And we just flowers over it, like something positive instead of making it.
Brilliant.
Instead of pointing a finger, turning it into a conversation.
Okay. Yeah. Well, and I'm going to put this next question up here because I think that's relevant to that, right? How many of you have done bystander intervention training in this space? So a few less hands, but there's something that y'all are talking about, right? That before you intervene, before you even think to do that, you have to notice that it's a problem, right? And that's an ongoing thing, right? Around language, around noticing situations where maybe you should intervene, that if you haven't done the work to recognize this stuff in your own life, it's going to be really hard to identify it in other people's lives, right? And that's the hard work. I still struggle with that around language, right, and rooting things out of my language. I used to use lame a lot. That's a really ableist phrase, idiot. I called my dog an idiot because she was being a jerk, right? But idiot is a really ableist, it's language, right, that's rooted in literal diagnoses of developmental disabilities. More on idiot are words that are rooted in those histories, right? And so how do we identify those things, and then how do we figure out how to intervene, right? And I think that that's what's so cool about all of the skills you all bring to this space is you think about these really cool ways to intervene. I would have never occurred to me to draw flowers over something like that. Like, how cool is that, right? Or, again, this is something that's so much easier when you have friends working in solidarity with you, that you're not the only one, especially when you're really anxious about maybe interrupting somebody is saying on campus, right? If they're calling someone a name or whatever it might be. So thinking about some of these ways that you can engage in actually practicing some of this work. I was hearing some of the cool work that the Theater of the Oppressed folks are doing, RAD, and that is also a really great opportunity on this campus to think about and practice this work, right? Because I think the intellectual practice of recognizing these things, being able to name the structures, being able to use statistics is really useful when you're having conversations. But if then you're silent when you see this stuff, how are you actually working in solidarity with the folks who are experiencing the brunt of this kind of violence, right? And I just got to do the bathroom stuff, right? This is a great poster I found, right? Do you feel like someone is using the wrong bathroom? Don't do anything to insult them or stare at them. Just respect them. Let them do their business, right? Because we're all simply using the facilities we feel safe in. And I always like to say, let my people pee, right? And we're all there to use the restroom and check our hair, not me. But, right, we're there to do our business, right? So even thinking about ways that, while this is an intervention technique, knowing when to say something and when to not, right? Because sometimes not staring and letting people do their business is a way of supporting them, right? So thinking about all the ways we want to interact with people and make them feel like they're invited and safe in these spaces, especially in a place where community is so central to the work that we do here, right? And so, okay, lastly, I'm going to wrap up. Resources at St. Ben, St. John's, right? Gender studies is an amazing resource. We have faculty in this space who are gender studies faculty, but we also have faculty in this space that don't teach with gender studies but do incredible gender studies work, right? PRISM is a great opportunity to get involved and to support folks, right? How many of you went to the drag show? Yes. So for those of y'all that didn't raise your hand, you got to go next year, right? Even if you're graduating, come back, right? Drag is a really amazing space to just have fun with gender, even if you aren't in drag, just to see the ways that people can play with gender. I mean, that plays such a really central role in queer communities, and we love inviting folks in to experience that with us, right? Institute for Women's Leadership, Men's Development Institute, right? These are student organizations on campus doing really amazing work that is offering programming for you all, right? So take advantage of these opportunities. Once you leave this space, you won't have as much access. Thinking about the library, faculty, staff, right? There are amazing folks on this campus who are here to support you all in doing this work, because I can't give you all the answers, right? I need you to figure out what accountability looks like for you in these spaces. Gender studies is a great place to start. Bystander intervention is a great place to start, but you figuring out where your intervention is going to be, where your strengths lie. If it's art, cool. If it's dance, if it's through your profession, whatever that might be, you figuring out what that means for you and how you can help hold other folks accountable. And we can't do that unless we're in community, right? So hopefully I've given you all some interesting things to think about. That's what I got for y'all. Thank you so very much for coming and spending your Tuesday evening with me. I think we have a few minutes for Q&A if you can stick around, but if not, again, thank you all so much, and for those of you that joined the conversation, for joining the conversation. Thanks, y'all.
So does anyone have any questions for Leah or any comments?
I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
Okay. I know you know a lot about gender and stuff like that, and I show my full support to like all the queer community, but I have a question about drag specifically.
Yeah.
I read this article about drag and how sometimes it's fun and it's okay and men do it to express themselves, but I wonder how you feel about the women, like the stereotypes that drag represents of like how women are, like they have to be feisty, or they have to wear like, they have to overdo makeup and stuff like that. I wonder how you feel about that. Like, do you feel like it's, they're like, you know, like, how do you feel?
Yeah. I mean, I'd love to hear what some other folks in this space think, because I think folks understand that differently. I mean, how many of you have been to drag shows or are familiar with drag culture? Some number of you, what do you all think about that? Because I think that that is a conversation to be had around our drag queens, particularly cis men who dress up in drag for entertainment. Are they sort of mimicking or objectifying femininity in a particular way? What do you all think? Yeah.
it's like hypersexualizing the stereotypes of like the gender binary. So it's a really good question because I thought the same thing because we performed in the drag show, and I was thinking I had that same thought crossed my mind and I wasn't able to come up with an answer, but it's still good question.
I almost think it mocks sexualization of women, and I think that it's like the fact that if a man dressing up as a woman, like it can't be sexualized, and I think that's one of the really cool things about it is that like you look at it, it's really sexy, but it's also not like objectification.
Okay, so there's something subversive about it, maybe. Okay.
A lot of times they also do like characters. In this drag show that we had here, there was one performer who actually like dressed up as like Edna Mode. And like
I read about that in the paper. It was so
and
cool.
then, like, the
It's like, why is that
crowd
picture not
would
there?
go on it.
Right.
So that one wasn't like sexualized females, and it was just kind of just like a fun like performance. So there's like different ways that performers go about it.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of just the conversation surrounding different forms of art and where they cross the line between like expression and art and creative outlet and then like other potentially not so wonderful things.
Fair enough. Okay. Yeah.
Can I tell you a quick story that'll kind of help explain my point?
Okay.
Okay, so like I was in 5th grade, right? And I was like super hard.
All the way back.
Boys. I was like, no, girly things are dumb. I don't need that. And I was like, whatever. I'm a strong girl. Blah, whatever. You know, conforming to thing. You know what I mean? Like I'm not conforming to the gender binary because it pissed me off even in 5th grade. And like I remember like. What was it? It came to my friend, we had a sleepover, she's like, you know, it's okay to be girly. And I was like, what? It like rocked my world. The next day I wore a skirt and the rest is history. And it was just like, I feel like that's kind of the point, like embracing, if that's naturally part of who you are, if that's like your authentic self, then embrace that. You know, and some people are very hypersexualized and that's okay, just to accept them as that. 'Cause that's some people's like part of their intersectionality, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I think to that point, right, and I appreciate y'all sharing, is that there's no one right answer. There are times when drag is quite potentially offensive and trivializing of femininity and womanhood. I think more often, though, and one of the things I love about drag is that it exaggerates and shows how much we can play with gender, right? One of my favorite things is when drag queens get up to perform and they are like on point and their makeup is fabulous and they look gorgeous. And people don't know what to do with themselves, particularly straight men. They're like, why is that person so attractive, right? And they don't quite know what to do with themselves. And it really exposes this really subversive thing that drag queens are doing about playing and exaggerating gender and how easy it is to assume femininity, right? And I think that's what's wonderful about drag kings, right? And that's a subculture that's not as well known, is most often cis women who dress up in masculine drag, and they play with gender too. And that there's something also more pointed about drag kings, like the way they sort of mock masculinity and how fragile it is in lots of ways, and it's really fun. But there's so many different kinds of drag, and there are ways that in some ways it's a celebration of the radical power of femininity, right? That someone would choose to don femininity, that they would feel empowered by that, totally subverts the cultural messages we get around what it means to be a woman and what it means to embody femininity, right? So I think it absolutely, there's times when it's problematic, but the times I've experienced, it's just been life-giving, right? So it's complicated. And I'm confused by it, I don't know. Confused by everything. Other questions? Yeah, David.
You talked about how boys are like socialized into believing they have access to women's bodies. I'm just curious what other effects that you think the way that we socialize boys into understanding masculinity and what other consequences you think?
Ooh, that's a heavy question.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so I talked about boys being socialized into having access to women's bodies. And so what are some of the other consequences for, what is the last piece? The way we socialize boys to be men?
Yeah, the way we socialize like hypermasculinity.
The way we socialize hypermasculinity. I mean, I think there's tons of consequences. And I mean, violence, the incredible levels of violence, not just against women, but men's violence against men. When we look at, and so Jackson Katz talks about this is sort of the first thing that's coming to mind, the film Tough Guys 2, if any of y'all have seen it. he talks a lot about the rhetoric, he talks about a lot of stuff, but the rhetoric of mass shooting, right? When we have a mass shooting, and just FYI, if anyone wants to do some research, if you define a mass shooting as someone with a gun who injures or murders 4 people or more in a space, there have been more mass shootings in the US than there are days in the year for the past several years, right? It is so commonplace that it doesn't even get reported unless it's really big, right? And who are the perpetrators of these mass shootings by and large? It's white men, right? And people talk about, oh, it's the trauma that they experienced, it's this, it's that. Well, young women and people of all genders experience trauma, so why are they not then doing these things at the same rate, right? But we so fail to give young men outlets to express anger and emotion. We pathologize therapy and the mental health field, right? And this can also be really culturally and racially specific as well, that the only outlet we give them is aggression and violence. And all of the ways that that has incredible ramifications for all of us in this space, right, is really devastating. There was something else I was thinking of. And we see that even in sexual violence, right? And one of the things that I do with some of my students is we talk about the language around sexual violence. Like, we're just gonna do this. What is the words for sex that y'all know, that you would actually use, not making love? Like, what are words for sex? Fucking, bang, screw, smash, nail, pound, hammer. Who's doing the hammering and the pounding when we say those words? Men, right? We teach sex as an act of aggression. Now, I'm not saying don't go do these things, right? You can do any of these words as long as it's consensual and healthy and you're talking about it like, right? If you desire to engage in sexual activity, you can do those things and they can be wonderful. But if you step back and look about the language we use for sex, oof, that's intense, y'all, right? And then I also ask my students, think of a word for sex where heterosexual sex, where there's a penis and a vagina, where the vagina is active and not the penis. Maybe writing, that's the only one that folks have come up with, right? And why is that, right? We construct women's bodies as passive and men as dominant. And then we wonder why we have a hard time with healthy sexuality, right? So I think that's another consequence, right? That it's not just the way we teach masculinity alone, but it's in this larger context in this culture that is misogynist, that is sexist, that is racist, that is ableist, that is all of these other things that also inform masculinity, right? Which makes just for a really messy way to engage in masculinity. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah.
A Big Hidden Brain podcast on NPR.
What
It's
is
a
it?
whole one about how American masculinity creates lonely men.
Oh, yeah.
And about the social isolation that men experience because they can't bond and form these emotional attachments in the same way because our culture tells them.
Which podcast is it?
It's The Hidden Brain.
Oh, yeah.
It's not small.
Let's see if we can find it so people can have this. Is it Man Up?
No,
Or The
oh,
Lonely
it's that
American
one,
Man?
The Lonely American Man. But they,
All right.
There's a number of them.
Cool. Yeah, and that's, y'all, podcasts. I've discovered podcasts. It's the best day of my life. Hidden Brain, I listen to Code Switch. It's not happening right now, but there's another one called Another Round that I love. There's so many amazing resources for y'all that talk about this stuff. So thank you for that. It's awesome. Until I can see that. Nothing tomorrow. It's 8:12. Maybe one more question. Anybody has one? Or comments or things y'all want to add? Because y'all have expertise in this stuff, right? Y'all live here. Y'all have taken cool classes. I don't math or science. If you want to add sciencey and math things. Yeah, why don't you? What's up?
I don't know if there's not an answer to it. So, being Violence Against Women Act, right?
Yeah.
It's being, I think, held up in part because the NRA is objecting to some new wording about domestic violence, the person who commits and then having a gun and actually blah blah blah. I don't even understand the whole bit. But do you? And then there's also a piece in there about Native women, I think, as well, right? Native American women. How much do you know? If you elaborate just a little bit, so the students have a bit of an understanding how this stuff, politically, is so touchy for some.
Yeah. I think you summed it up, right? That the way, and this is capitalism, right? But the way money works, like we silo these things even at the structural level, right? Like economics is over here, gun rights is over here, violence against women is here, indigenous native folks issues are over here. But to this end, right, that we have this act, the Violence Against Women Act, and it gets stopped. Because folks want to say, if you have a history of domestic violence, maybe you shouldn't own a gun, right? But the NRA is like, oh, that's gun rights, right? Without the context of recognizing that the highest rate of folks being murdered by their partners is when they're leaving a domestic violence relationship, the act of leaving, and if there's a gun in the house. Those are the two things that come together where folks who are leaving abusive relationships die, right? There's a lot of complexity around policing on native land, on reservations, and who has jurisdiction and who doesn't, right? And so we see, again, all oppression is connected, right? That when we silo these things out, we fail to be able to see how we need to have these conversations at the intersection, right? Who's at the table, who's having these conversations, and how then do we combat these institutions and this culture and these ideologies, right? But that's, again, where, I mean, and I had a slide up here and I didn't, I took it away and I don't know why. How many, do y'all know who your politicians are in Minnesota? Who are they? Anyone? It's two women right now, at least the Klobuchar. Yeah, right? Have their numbers in your phone. Call them, right? There's actually ResistBot. Do y'all know about ResistBot? Okay, that's one of the only ways I can contact my legislators. I'm very lazy. But we still need to do this, right? ResistBot is this really cool thing where you text a number, Google it, ResistBot. You text a number, you put in your address, and it finds your senators, it finds your representative, it finds your governor. And if you want to send them a letter, all you have to do is text some stuff, and it faxes a letter to them with a fancy signature. Like, it's super amazing, right? And this is the stuff where we, even if you are critical of a particular political regime or whoever's in office, you can affect change by using your voice in that capacity, right? And ResistBot has made that so incredibly easy. Have the numbers of the folks on speed dial in your phone, right? Because that's how we affect change at that level. Because y'all have knowledge and the skills and the tools to talk about this stuff in ways that most folks in the US don't. So I charge you to have that conversation, to hold people accountable and say, look at these connections, right? Make the connections for people and help them understand why you're making those connections. Yeah?
Kind of similar to that, and I can't think of what it's called. Maybe somebody will know when I say it. There's an app where you can, basically, it has a bunch of like social issues that are big at the time and different stances or reactions to them. And then you can basically like click on it and it'll give you like a link or something to write to or call someone to call. And
do you know what it is?
5 calls?
Yes, yes. It connects you like directly with who you would need to talk to about such an issue. I think part of like making
cool.
Maybe like identify where you're at, like locationally. Yeah.
Cool. So 5 calls. Download this because that's the thing.
Like use it as if we're doing like a persuasive paper on a
Totally.
social issue, have us actually be active in making that change, not just spreading.
Brilliant. And I need those form letters. I don't know about y'all, because sometimes like I have a stance on an issue, but I'm like, I don't know what to write in the letter. And so 5 calls.
Like pre-written like scripts, basically, where it's just like.
And you can call, read the thing, send the email, do whatever, right? And so transfer that to your ResistBot, write all your politicians, right? Flood their inbox. Make them think that you're bugging them too much, because that still means you need to do more, right? Other questions? Well, actually, I'm going to stop. It's 8:17. Y'all have given me so much of your valuable time. It is, I mean, this is my last thing. I've been here 2 days. It is so wonderful to see all of y'all's faces and have you here and to share this time with you all. So thank you for being such gracious hosts. And thank you so much for Brandon and all of you that you do. He made my time here wonderful and amazing. And I hope you all know how much he works for y'all and how much you don't see of what he does and the way he advocates for y'all. Because even when he doesn't have the time to do it after working 89 hours, he brings me in to do some of that work, right? He brings other speakers in to do that work. That any change you see on this campus in some way is connected to this person right here. So a round of applause for Brandon. Thank you. Yeah. So thank you all so much. Oh my God. Oh yeah. Thank you all so much.